All right. Hey, everybody. It is good to see you today and to I'll be back to take another look at entering into God's promises, a series that we started last week. And before we get into that, I just wanted to share very briefly a couple highlights from prayer this week and a couple highlights from having time in groups. It was great to be gathered with a couple groups of you throughout this past week and to take time to check in and see what God's been up to in each other's lives, and to take time to turn our hearts towards God's word to us, and also to be listening for what He might be speaking to us in the present moment. It was just a great time. I'm very thankful for it and thankful to be part of God's work in each other's lives. If you have not had a chance to find your way into a group yet, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It has been really rich and rewarding for a number of us, and we would certainly hate for anybody to be missing out on the journey of following Jesus together and practicing Jesus's way together. So wanted to throw that out. Also, had a great time of prayer on Thursday, and once again, just could not shake the sense that God is up to some really awesome things in us and around us. There are some parts of it that I think we're starting to be able to see and discern and recognize, but also I'm very confident that there are a number of things that we can't yet see, and there are things bigger even than Hope Church that He's inviting us to be part of as His church. So for whatever that's worth, I pray that it stirs your heart and encourages you and inspires you to dive in as you're following Jesus together. And actually had a time this morning, this is actually Saturday, when I was reminded of that same thing, just the sense that God is doing some cool things and He is inviting us to be part of it. So anyway, excited, certainly happy to be part of God's work in each other's lives, and I love that we get to do this together. So today we are headed back into the early chapters of Joshua, and a really seminal early vision of God's people entering into God's promises. So if you haven't read Joshua before, or maybe it's been a very long time, I would strongly encourage you to go back and take a few minutes, maybe at least read Joshua chapters 1 through 8. It'll be a pretty exciting read with a number of short stories unfolding as God's people are finally entering into promises that have shaped the hopes and the imaginations of their nation for literally hundreds of years, and through all sorts of impossible and hopeless, seemingly, circumstances, until finally, through some remarkable twists and turns that only God could bring about, the people were at the threshold of seeing God's promises come to pass. Now, this actually wasn't the first time that the nation had been at this threshold, and we looked at this a little bit last week. A previous generation had been in this exact same scenario, but when they came to the threshold of God's promises, they were gripped by fear of change and a fear of the challenges that they might face. And so suddenly the people became extremely nostalgic for the way things used to be. And instead of going on with God, the people began clamoring for the security and the predictability of their old way of life when they were slaves in Egypt. And in doing so, the Joshua actually says that the people despise God. And of course, that's something that none of us ever want to be said about us at any point in our lives. So anyway, it was pretty strong, a pretty distinct difference when people decide to follow God and when people decide that security and predictability is preferable to moving ahead in God's promises. So Uh, Having said that, let's turn to today's passage in Joshua chapter 3, and we'll be reading specifically verses 1 through 6. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim, and they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. And at the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Joshua said to the priests, take up the ark of the covenant and pass on before the people. So they took up the ark of the covenant and they went before the people. So, here's the phrase that really jumps out and grabs a hold of me in this passage. You have not passed this way before. So, I love this phrase partially because it's kind of obvious. The people had never been to this place before. It's a little bit mundane. It's the kind of phrase that might be easy to quickly read past without giving it much thought or attention. But something I think opens up in this little phrase, this little insignificant phrase, that you have not passed this way before. It's a subtle reminder not to get ahead of ourselves, even when we're so close to God's promises that we can see it, we can almost taste it, even when it's right there in front of us. God reminds us, you haven't been this way before. And there's something comforting in this reminder if we're listening carefully. So God has brought us this far through all sorts of challenging circumstances, both in our personal lives and in the history of us as a worshiping body. Lots of water has gone under the bridge. God has been faithful to see us through to this point. Now, looking to this story, there's a river to cross. There are giants to face. There are battles to be fought. And as for right now, at least for these people, the new identity and the new life that God had promised them, that they had imagined and hoped for literally generations and generations, but really that was completely new to them. They really hadn't been that way before. And there's something comforting in knowing that God knows the way, and God is the way for us. He goes before us, he's followable, and he is the God who remains with us even when we're close to things, even when it seems like we could probably just press ahead and grab a hold of something that's out in front of us. Even then, God is still with us, and God is still showing the way. So here's a second detail that really jumps out and kind of grabs me. This little bit about remaining 2,000 cubits behind God's presence. And in my Bible, and probably likely in yours, or at least on your phone through Google, you can look up and see what that actually means. And in our terms, that's about half a mile. So even at the threshold, when it probably seemed like the people could just find a good place to cross the river, they could really ram this thing home and get into the good stuff. When it finally probably seemed like they could actually see their own way forward, this subtle reminder to back off and let God lead, and to stay half a mile behind where he was taking them, so that they could discern the way they should go. So in all this business of following God, and all this business of entering into God's promises, and for us following Jesus together, there's always room for space. There's always some breathing room in this. There's always room for some perspective and wisdom. Also, if we're attentive to the details in here, there's not really micromanagement taking place. There's engagement on the part of the people as they follow God into his promises. The way this all plays out, they need to keep one eye on God, and they need to keep one eye on the steps immediately in front of them. And this is a pretty consistent feature, as I've noted before, in the narratives of people following God and participating in what God is doing on their behalf. So the parameters and the path are set, but as God's half a mile out in front, it leaves a little bit of the breathing room, as we said, and it empowers the people to be taking one step at a time, because half a mile out, they obviously can't see the exact footsteps that the priests were taking as they carried the presence of God on their shoulders, but they can see with that perspective the way to go. So a nice balance in there. And for us, how can we pull all of this together? And how can this short passage empower us as a people wanting to live into God's promises and God's purposes for us here and now? Even after having counted the cost, so this is much different than the first generation in Numbers 13 that we looked at last week. The first generation was not willing to pay the price of change, and they were not willing to pay the price of the challenge that lied ahead. But this generation was. They counted the cost and they were ready to go. And even after having done that, even after having made up their minds, and hopefully our minds, to step out into God's purposes and promises, we still need to keep watching, we need to keep waiting, and we need to keep walking. So in all things, we want God to stay out in front of us. In fact, in this instance, half a mile out, so it's a pretty good distance. We don't want to be in a hurry. We don't want to compete with God in trying to figure out how things can work and how to walk it out and how to find a way through into his promises. Instead, we want to invest ourselves in watching and waiting on him. And once there's a little bit of movement, as the people in this story no doubt notice the first few steps that the priests took as they left the camp, even when we notice a little bit of movement, we still want to keep watching and we still want to keep waiting. We want to understand what God is doing out in front of us. We want to have some perspective on what God's doing. We want to see the way, and we want to glean everything we can in advance, learning from this example, understanding that where God is going, we are going to be walking out after him. So this isn't just a hypothetical exercise, and I think for us as we're looking to the way of Jesus, it's not just something that happens in our mind. It's not just a religious exercise as we consider the way of Jesus. We want to do that as a people who understand we are being called out to follow in that same way. So then we watch, we wait, and finally we walk. We go, we follow, we take one step after the other, we get in the action of things, and we participate in what God is doing on our behalf, in us and through us. And in doing all that, we enter into God's promises and purposes for us. So there you have it. Let's keep at this. Let's remember God's goodness and faithfulness, that he's brought us this far, and he has more for us ahead in the future. And I hope you enjoyed this little snapshot from Joshua chapter 3 on entering God's promises, taken from the early chapters of Joshua. Again, I'm excited and thankful to be doing this together. If you haven't had a chance yet to get together with a group of people, either live or using technology or some combination thereof, I hope and pray that you will take advantage of that opportunity. God has made us the kind of people who need each other and who do better and who complement each other. So I need you in my life, and we all need each other in each other's lives. So we want to do that faithfully. We want to follow Jesus together. And as we watch and we wait, we want to walk out the path that God has before us. Love you guys, and I'll see you soon.